right, so this is a Shim Tools XIEM bulb. When you buy these, they come with more than one width of tip so that you can kind of change it out. The wider tip tends to work better for slip trailing because it can let chunks of grog through if they're not too large in size. And then they have narrower tips for if you need more kind of tiny precision application. I tend to just use the one larger tip, but this is the one I use for slip trailing and glaze application, and I cleaned it out last night. But basically, I will show you how to fill and clean this tool so you can use it, because it's a great way to apply glaze at a full thickness in one pass in a very targeted, kind of isolated spot without overlapping it with others. So, okay, this is probably still mixed up pretty well from earlier. So I'm going to put some in here and then squeeze the bulb, put it in the glaze, and suck it up.
What did you call that again?
It's a trailing syringe, a bulb syringe. And then the brand is XIEM. There's also the Pinel bulb, which only comes with the one tip size, but this is the one I know when you buy it, you can get more than one size of tip. Yeah, like if you see them, I don't think it really matters what brand. If you see one with the, interchangeable tips, that's probably a good one to use. Because then you can kind of change it out to get different sizes of marks. So then you kind of make sure the glaze is falling toward the tip. I usually will test it either on a sponge or a little bit of a bat to make sure it's flowing well. And then you can go in and apply. And I think I'll use that partially on the petals. So when you're trailing, I usually do the outside edge and then kind of go back and fill toward the interior.
You don't care if it runs, right?
Well, I mean, you do, but so the way you're applying it with the trailer, it kind of, unless you over apply it, you can kind of go back and lightly squeeze and fill. And then as long as it's not too heavy, it kind of will stay put. Plus, if it kind of runs a little bit, you can go back and scrape it off, but you have to wait for it to dry first. You have to use very light pressure because you're just trying to get enough out to get a uniform thickness, but not so much that it gets really, really heavy. But if you ever encounter a problem, like let's say you have a spot that's too thick, you get a brush that's kind of dry, and you can go to that glaze and soak some of it up.
Why not put it on with the brush? Just paint it on.
You could, but the slip trailer gets it on a little puffier. So as you're applying it, it stays wet and it's really thick so that you can get really tiny little areas next to each other, full thickness, without having to try to do it with the brush, which usually has a natural kind of taper because of the way the brush applies it. You can also apply glaze with really fine lines this way. So if you want to kind of glaze in a way that's a little bit more like with drawing line, the slip trailer can be a really good one for that. So then I can kind of put a different color of glaze kind of coming up to meet all those little feathered lines. Okay. I think that's all I'm going to do with that one. And then you squeeze it, fill it with water. I always make sure to do at least one pass through the metal tip so that it's all cleared out. And then let's do the pearl for the sclera. This one's the rainforest. The rainforest green. It's one of the celadons. No, it's a pretty soft brush. I find that the soft brushes kind of help the glaze flow better when you're doing that thick application. And I think, a lot of these are going to be things where, because the glazes get kind of so powdery in their dry form, they never look like what they look like raw. And because of the way you're doing this, you don't really want to drag the tool backwards. You always want to pull away from where you're applying the glaze, because if you push back into the glaze, like go back to the left, for example, you can put dry glaze into the tip of the trailer and kind of clog it. So kind of like with brushing, you still want to drag the trailer away from where you're applying. So the nice thing about the slip trailing bulb is you have a lot of control with where you apply it. And then you can get it really that full thickness coat fast while it's still all shiny wet, and you won't have to go back over it. It's just one and done. And you get a little bit more control over the shape, the precise edges, and creating good points. on the tips of things, whereas brushes tend to kind of make things fatter and kind of pointier. So like the very thin lines and the tight points are going to be a little easier to accomplish with the slip trailer. Then that, once it's dry, I'm going to put wax on it so that I can do a different color of glaze over the remainder of the interior. So this is going to be like this floral motif embedded around a different color. So I think I might do maybe the white on the inside and the black on the outside, and then do some different colored polka dots on top of the black. So there's some kind of interest in color quality, but again, like a simpler motif. So it's not detracting from the more important hierarchy imagery, which is on the interior. So supporting kind of aesthetic character. Okay, so then that's drying so that I can do the black on the outside while I'm waiting for that interior to dry. You could, right? Like the thing is though, at this point, what you're deciding about is whether you prefer the visual qualities of the glaze, because glazes have a certain amount of depth and you can play with different amounts of sheen and visual texture, where underglazes tend to be very flat in terms of like the kind of visual depth and the sheen. They won't vary. No, certainly not. You can put underglazes under your glazes all day long, any color you want. Like, let's say you wanted to do this, but you wanted to do it very painterly. So then you use the underglazes to brush on the floral motif. You could do that instead, and then just like clear glaze the interior. With this, you'll see when it's finished that the glazes, when they're kind of applied in a decorative motif, they might shift a little. They have some different visual textures. They have some different texture qualities within the glaze, whether they move a little bit, they juxtapose with each other, they blend kind of in a certain way. Because they're molten glass, they're just going to have a different visual quality than the underglazes will have. So you just have to decide which visual quality you're after. Not necessarily. I think underglazes can sometimes make the surface of the bisque a little bit less absorbent because they have a tighter particle than the bisque does. So you might notice when you're putting glaze on top where the underglaze is, it doesn't dry quite as fast, or it looks like it's a little bit thinner because I think it's creating a tiny bit of a resist. But if you put underglaze on before you bisque fire, I found that bisque firing it makes that absorbency issue a little bit less prominent. All of these have been stirred recently, but I'm not just going to assume that they're going to stay incorporated. So I always give them a little bit of a swirl when I pick them back up, just in case anything's settled. And the ones that are creamier are always going to take longer to settle, like a long time, because that's just how they're designed. In general, these glazes that you have here in the studio aren't really the ones that are going to do a lot of settling because they're made by industry to not do that. But let's say you were dealing with buckets of glaze in a community studio, you would be dealing with that part of it. So it's just something to be aware of, because if you're ever in a different kind of studio, it's going to be good to know that you're going to get different behavior from a glaze that's mixed in that studio versus one that's bottled. You can use it either way, but I prefer to use it on greenware because once you fire that underglaze onto the bisqueware, there's like that absorbency issue gets resolved by bisquing it on there, and then also you can't possibly remove it as you're applying glaze on other surface. If you put underglaze on at bisque, then, depending on how you apply the glaze, it could be problematic. I find that using this flat brush is a little bit better to apply these satin glazes than the fluffy one as I'm doing it, just kind of the way they're formulated. Because the flat brush, I have a little bit more force to kind of push it and move it because it has like a lot more drag on the satin glazes. Whereas the ones that are a little bit more runny, a fluffier brush will be great because you have a little bit more glaze in it and you can kind of lay down a fluffier coat and it'll drag really well. This one, I need a little bit of pressure to move it along. So the flatter brush works better than the fluffy one. And I also am going to be pointing the brush towards the edge that I'm applying the wax to so that I can really see where the brush is stopping and I don't accidentally go too far with the wax. Because like we talked about, once the wax goes down on the bisque, that's it. Just a little bit. It varies, but it's between, an 1/8 and a 1/16 of an inch, just depending on where along the edge it is, but just a little bit for that next glaze to grab onto. And it's the same thing I did with that tape because I had the tape down when I waxed it. There's the depth of the tape. There's no wax on, and that's enough for the next glaze to grab onto. I did the whole thing, and then there's just a little tiny, you might be able to see it, there's a little tiny halo of the glaze that's a little bit lighter in color where the wax isn't.
That's what I was seeing.
Yeah, so that lighter edge, just right around where the wax is applied, you can kind of see it on the top of the petals better. That's where I want the glaze that's going on top to kind of overlap and make sure they're sealed together well. So I just left a little tiny bit all the way around the whole thing for that to make sure it grabs on. And then this black over the outside. So now that wax has to dry, so I'm going to go back and do some polka dots on the black on the outside. I'm going to heal those pinholes up first. Floats, I expect, on top of a satin black are going to be really nice as far as kind of getting the shiny spot, enough color, a little bit of movement, that kind of transition halo between. So I think blue polka dots on the outside of this black is all I'm going to do. I think that'll be enough. And I think the floats in general would be a good fit for something like this, where you're trying to do like I've heard some people refer to it as like the frozen water technique or whatever, where you have a satin glaze down and then you put dots of a shiny glaze on top. And then as they kind of bleed, they can blend into each other. If the glaze you put on top has a little bit of movement, they'll kind of spread out and get closer to each other. And because these are going to kind of melt and move, like I'm not that worried about what shape they are. They can be round-ish. But they're not going to stay perfectly the shape I apply, I don't think. That's not usually how this kind of relationship works. But I do want to leave some space between them because what I'm hoping they'll do is kind of bleed together and fill some of the negative space between them. And even if they don't, it'll still be attractive.
So tell us the color again. It's the base is black, and what is that?
The satin black is the base, and then the indigo float is the color that I'm doing the dots in. And then before I applied this, I went to the black and rubbed down the glaze a little bit to get rid of the pinholes. I hope that Pat or one of y'all will send me pictures of how these turned out so I know whether or not I led y'all astray. Just because these are glazes, a lot of them I've never used, so I'm using what I understand about how glazes like to be applied. And usually that wisdom is sufficient to get you a long way. That's the kind of thing you learn with lots of experimentation is like, okay, this type of glaze usually does this type of thing, and this type of glaze usually does this type of thing, which is something that comes from a lot of that experience and experimentation. You start to learn all those different relationships that you like. And the more you experiment, the more of those things you'll find.
Now, if your wax resist had not been dry, what would that have done to your?
Well, the glaze will stick in it, you know, and then you have to kind of scrape it off and you might have to Yeah, so the two things that'll happen is either if your wax is wet, the glaze will stick in the spots where it's wet, and it might just be like it's all dry except for this one spot where the wax was a little thicker and the glaze kind of sticks right there. A lot of times when you go back and sponge, it'll still kind of clean it out as long as you don't let it dry the rest of the way. And then if you apply your wax too thin, you'll still get some glaze adhesion on the waxed areas. So you want to make sure you use like full concentration wax. Don't be shy. Get like a nice thick coat on there. And you just can do it once because after that, the resist is applied. It won't take any more. And then let that dry. And then when you apply the glaze to it, it should bead up really well and move off the edges. So then you can go back and where it's beaded up, that's fine. You can clean it off. If it's beaded up, the glaze was dry or the wax was dry. So it'll stay wet and you have long enough to go back in with a damp sponge. I will. Yeah. But I'm thinking, I don't know, I'm thinking about if I want to do the white or if I want to do like some stripes of a color that's going down into this negative space and then just kind of like dab that around the rim so there's an alternating color sitting right on the rim. I think that might be interesting because the way this bowl was thrown, the rim has got kind of like a roundness, a fatness, a departure point. So when the brush hits it, it kind of stops. So that gives me an opportunity for this fairly controlled ring that I can apply the other glaze to, or I could leave it raw if I wanted to. Because if you left it there, like we talked about, it will stay and melt and become part of the glaze. So just like when you wax the feet, you just have to go back and clean it off. Just periodically rotate the brush or the sponge so you have a clean spot. And now look at that. Very precise. So that's kind of the advantage of doing your application that way, which is different than layering it on top. So when you're trying to get something where it's very targeted application, then you can trail it in, wax it, and then apply the rest. And you get very specific application of different glazes within a very narrow kind of margin of space. So like, you know, if you brush it on top, you're layering it like I layered it on this one. So that glaze that's underneath is going to have an influence on the glaze that's on top. When you don't put another glaze underneath, like each glaze can stand on its own. They still have an edge where they touch, where they'll kind of merge and bleed into each other. But it's like each glaze's own personality is less disrupted. So you can kind of count on this one's going to be exactly like this because I put it on by itself next to this one that's exactly like itself. So you get the full effect of each glaze on its own. Whereas if you put it on top of something, that relationship is different. On top of whites, they tend to get a little bit more pastel. On top of blacks, unless it's very opaque and has a lot of pigment, you will mostly lose it because the black will kind of eat it up. Yeah, any color glaze you want, any relationship, they can, as long as they just touch each other, you shouldn't have a bald patch in between. And then you can kind of use the brush or the trailer to a target apply the kind of more illustrative narrative components of the decoration and wax over those. And I usually do the thing that's covering the majority of the surface last. So I go in and do the small things, wax over those, and then I can just brush or pour the glaze over the rest of the surface so that is more evenly applied. So when I'm doing a rim like this, I'm using the side of a flat brush and I'm dabbing. And I just kind of rotate it a little bit to wrap the rim. Yeah, this is the Tangelo one, which I used on the rim of that one. And again, because it's right on the rim like this, if it runs down just a little bit, I think that'll be okay. Yeah, I mean, the satin, it doesn't move as much. Part of how it's formulated is it really stays put and it's very opaque. Because in order to make it really opaque, they have to put a lot of opacifier and stabilizing agent into the glaze. Shiny glazes are usually where you're going to be able to get runniness. So while I don't expect the Celadon to run, it will be okay if it does because it's right next to a satin glaze, so it's not going to have very far to go. Yeah, so we're talking about a white and a black next to a colored rim that's shiny. So the satin glazes are really good at helping highlight your forms, right? Because they'll catch all the shadows. So if you have a really dynamic form, then a satin glaze could be a really good fit. Whereas if you have things you're trying to hide about your work, the shiny glaze will help you hide it because it'll bounce all the light away from the parts you don't like. So if you're interested in highlighting your texture, satins are great. If you're trying to hide something, opaque and shiny is a good bet. So that now composition, now there's not a dead zone. So all of this piece has some kind of information on it. And then I'm just going to check the rim and make sure there's not some more Tangelo I need to apply. Just to make sure that is filled to the edge. Yep, all right, that's that one.
I really love this.